History will determine whether we were ready. Just kidding. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Immigrant Affairs and Civil Rights and Equity Committee. I want to thank my fellow members for joining me today. We have a lot of attention. There seems to be a series of changes. This is a very fluid and dynamic subject matter. Every day it seems we get up with some greater, more extreme, more dramatic revelation, some greater insult, some greater offense to our sense of what should be a civil society and how we should handle these problems. We in the committee look forward to trying to construct public policy that responds to the core issues and to stay away from the rancor and the rhetoric that is so prevalent in our civic discourse today. I am Gil Cedillo. I am the chair of the committee, and I think we are prepared to go forward. We will open with public comment. There are a series of speakers. What is their time for each one?
Depends on how many items we're going to speak on.
Public
so it's
comment is 1 minute.
And 2 minutes per item.
And
So 1 minute per item.
No, and then it's multiple items, then it's 2 minute maximum.
Okay.
Sir.
Right. And the public comment.
Sir.
Okay. So on the first list of public comment, we're going to call you up to make your 1 minute presentations on public comment. You will have you have subject matter opportunities that will come up as we go through the agenda. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chair, the cards are on item number 2, so would the committee like to hear item 2?
Can I make a suggestion? Can we take all items together? Whoever's going to speak, Mr. Chair, and then including general public comment?
There's no general public comment today because it's a special meeting, but on all of the comment cards that have been submitted are only on item 2, so you could take 1 and 3 now, and there would be no cards. Close those and then continue on to number 2 if you'd like, or whatever.
That sounds like a great suggestion.
Okay.
Are you okay with that?
What would you like to do?
What he just suggested.
Go in order? Okay.
Take all comments.
Items 1 and 2. Would you like to take up items 1 and 2?
1 and 3.
1 and 3, I'm sorry.
1 and 3.
Sure.
Okay. Item number 1 is a motion Martinez Cedillo relative to request for Los Angeles Police Department, Detective Support and Vice Division and City Attorney to report on the efforts to combat human trafficking in the City of Los Angeles and LAPD report on efforts to combat human trafficking in the city. Item number 3 is a City Attorney report and ordinance relative to adding Article 5.4 to the Los Angeles Municipal Code to establish legal protections against the disclosure of tenants' information or citizenship status to third parties.
Okay, so let's do that.
We'll go ahead and take comment. Oh,
No, we're going to do items 1 and 3.
you want to take a...
And then we'll take
You don't
comment
want-
when we do item 2.
Okay.
So that it's coherent.
Come on up. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for scheduling this motion, and thank you for seconding it. I just want to say, colleagues, I introduced this motion to make sure that we continue to address this issue. Not only it doesn't only affect my district, but it affects all of our districts. I know Mr. Rue isn't here, but in his district, it affects portions of Western, Mr. Wesson's district in Koreatown, on Western as well. Mr. Cedillo in your district in MacArthur Park, and Mr. Price on your district on Figueroa. So since I've been elected, I've been trying to do everything I can, working in collaboration with our partners in LAPD to address this issue. I think we need multiple approaches, and I think we need to start looking at it as a citywide issue and not only district by district. So this is why I've asked our partners to come here and talk about and give us an update as to what we're doing, because I think I've made it abundantly clear that our girls are not for sale in our city or anywhere else in our country. So thank you for being here.
Just a second.
Sure.
Absolutely, ma'am. I'm Captain Paul Espinoza. I'm actually the commanding officer of Juvenile Division. I'm assisting Captain Lee with this presentation here today since she could not be here, but I also have a stake in this because one of my units is the Internet Crimes Against Children unit. So we work hand in hand with what you're doing in the overall missions and goals. Who I have with me today is Lieutenant Dion Watts from Detective Support and Vice Division, who oversees human trafficking. And what she'll touch on, because she has most of the details, are our training and efforts citywide, our external training and community efforts, to assist with that, as well as our outreach and awareness to our victims. And then we'll talk a little bit about our partnerships with different entities, agencies, both inside and out, even internal with Internet Crimes Against Children. We'll talk a little bit about that, how that helps our goals. And then we'll also touch on some of those enforcement efforts on some of the areas that you just mentioned.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Well, I'll start with training, and just so everyone understands, Detective Support and Vice Division is the citywide and the policy section for detective or for vice and human trafficking issues. We oversee the 21 vice units, so we assist them in any way that we can, and vice versa. I'll start with training, and what we've done thus far is we've integrated survivor experiences and perspectives into all of our training. We have in-person training, we also have video. So at some trainings, we actually have the survivor come and speak in person to the attendees. It's a 40-hour post-certified course that we've given to first responders. That includes fire department. We trained all of the captains and above at the fire department last year. We train hospital staff, hotel staff. We do school presentations and community groups. We distribute human trafficking indicator cards for the first responders. So when they leave the training, they have a card that they can stick in their pocket if they have any questions. They can look at the card and they can determine what portion of it they need help on. We also do training for school administrators to identify the signs of human trafficking and recruitment. That was done by Operations Valley Bureau recently. We attend regular meetings with our professionals, our allied professionals, where we share lessons learned and best practices. We provide worldwide training and information, and provide information to visitors from Korea, Australia, other states. We have, last week, we just came back from Canada, where DSVD investigators actually went to Canada to provide training to the agency there. For our outreach, we've partnered with the Mayor's Commission on the Status of Women to create a public awareness campaign called Look Again. It involves a PSA with a survivor that will be coming out soon, hopefully. Bus boards, bus bench ads, which are in the valley as well as other areas throughout the city. We also have children at work signs that have not been put up yet, but those will be focused mainly in the areas that we have some serious issues with child sex trafficking. But that's an effort that we're still working on because of some issues with the neighborhoods. We have focused some of our efforts on the LGBTQ and at-risk youth or victims of commercial sex exploitation. We specifically in Hollywood have identified the areas that are frequented by the individuals and their patterns of behavior. We've coordinated our efforts with the NGOs or our non-governmental agencies, organizations, to provide literature, resources for any of the young individuals that we do come across out there. Every operation Hollywood has, they work with Journey Out from the Valley. They're actually in the station so that if we do have adults and juveniles as well, but mainly adults because that's who they deal with. We provide literature, they provide opportunities for education and housing, work training, and their goal is to get the women out of the life, keep them out of the life, and provide them the strength, encouragement that they need to stay out with job training and everything they need. In Southeast Division, we have Saving Innocence, who works directly with our South Bureau Human Trafficking Unit, and specifically Southeast Vice. They work with the CSEC population, which is the the commercial sexually exploited children population. We have Saving Innocence that also works down in the South End. We've expanded all of our human trafficking awareness efforts on social media. We have a LAPD human trafficking unit Twitter page. We post messages. We pay attention to what's going on in the news. We recently had some CBS News and Crime Watch Daily who did a ride-along with our South Bureau Human Trafficking Unit, so that's out in the news. We had Times Magazine photojournalist who's doing an art exhibit. It's currently in New York, and that's specifically geared towards the human trafficking as well. As far as our partnerships go, they've grown in some ways, and then we also have the same ones, which are FBI and LASD, the Sheriff's Department, where we have one investigator embedded in each of those task forces and units. We partner with the Internet Crimes Against Children, who the captain mentioned. We work with them on Operation Broken Heart and multiple HT investigations. On April 1st, our first responders protocol was expanded citywide. That is something that we've been working on. We had a trial run with it down in South Bureau with 77th and Southeast. That has now been expanded citywide. What that means to the community is that when there is a child who has been sexually exploited and they've been identified, when the police officers get to the location and we're trying to help them out, we make that first call to the DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services hotline, and within 90 minutes they have agreed and signed a contract. We have an MOA with them that it will take them about 90 minutes to get there. That means that our officers and the community, as well as the child, is not affected for a prolonged period of time. In addition to the first responders protocol, we're also doing the safe zone signage. We're working with probation, who has big posters, not posters, I'm sorry, they're metal signs that they want to put up, similar to the ones that we have at our fire stations for safe drop-offs, not to abandon your children. They have safe zone signage in the county. What they would like to do is partner with the city and put that signage up in fire stations, libraries, and other locations that if a child were to get themselves into a sticky situation or they are trying to escape from one, they have a place to go. When they see the sign, they know that they can get some sort of help at those locations. And then we have our daily conversations with all of our partners, probation, FBI, family services. And this is good news for everyone, I think. A couple of days ago, the California Department of Social Services, in partnership with the LAPD, due to the harm reduction strategy that they were trying to work on, we as a department have supported AB 2992. That should be on the next ballot in November, we're hoping, which will provide funding for all post-certified training for police officers who are going through academies. That will be statewide. That will be human trafficking training as well as sexually exploited children training. So we're hoping that gets on the ballot and it does get passed, because that will save, I think, or I should say, it'll probably help a lot more children or individuals involved in human trafficking to be identified sooner rather than later. And as far as our enforcement, I know there was a question about what we're doing on all of our corridors. So I'll start with DSVD. Again, we are citywide. We have 6 investigators that are assigned to the division. We work in conjunction with all of our vice units. We do 2 major planned operations throughout the year. We have Operation Reclaim and Rebuild, that's typically done at the beginning of the year, and Operation Summer Rescue. Both of those operations involve all 21 divisions at the same time during the same 2 to 3 day period. In addition to those operations, we work daily with Crime Stoppers tips that come into the division. We initiate our own online investigations. We have informants that we recently have signed up, which is a big step in our section, in our division, because it's really opened some doors to individuals that we would never have known about without that. We have referrals and calls from the area vice units, and we also provide a 24-hour response for any minor who has been identified as an exploited child. So with that being said, all of our CSEC rescues in 2017 the number was 72 for DSVD. Year-to-date, we're at 32. The Western and Santa Monica corridor is handled by Hollywood Division primarily, but it also works its way into Olympic, so they work together on a regular basis to make sure that the problem is solved in a multi-unit response. Their heaviest times in those areas are between 2 and 5 a.m., so they've had to adjust their schedules. When the captain approves and they're not working on anything else, they do adjust so that they can be out there and they can help. Journey out, like I said earlier, is always at the station when they do their operations. That includes a social worker and a survivor, so that when they do meet a human trafficking victim, there's a higher chance that that victim will identify with someone who can provide assistance. As we do with all of our areas, we have high visibility. We do John stings, undercover operations, outcalls, in-calls. We work off of tips. Anything that the community provides to us, we follow up on if we have a good lead. In Hollywood Division specifically, in that Western and Santa Monica area, there is also a camera that's mounted, so Hollywood Vice can monitor the camera and the activity that's going on in the area. In that area, Hollywood Division has 15 rescues for 2017 and to the present. The Figueroa Corridor, that's Southeast Division, primarily Southeast Division. They work 90% of the time on that corridor. All of their activities are in that corridor. They also do the high visibility, and they do all of the same things that Hollywood Division does. They had 67 rescues last year, 67 sexually exploited children. They focus primarily on the CSEC population as well, and they had 67 with 17 trafficking arrests and about 40 convictions from those arrests. And finally, the Van Nuys and Sepulveda corridors, we have Valley Bureau Human Trafficking Task Force that has a staff out there as well as the overtime details that they have funding for. They work in the high visibility arena with the marked black and whites as well. They do all of the same things that we do, the John Stings UC operations, and they have bureau task forces every other month. So that means that all 7 divisions get together, all their vice units get together, and they work their problem areas. As far as their contacts and their outreach, they have Neighborhood Watch. They do a lot of they have a special email address that they get tips, communication, community meetings, etc. So they have a lot of resources out there as well. And their CSEC rescues were 10 for last year, 10 trafficking arrests and 5 pimping arrests as well.
I'm sorry, I may have been distracted. Did you talk about MacArthur Park?
No, I did not talk about MacArthur Park.
Okay.
Specifically, did you have?
I have some questions about that as well.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you have any closing comments or anything, Captain?
No, we're ready for questions, ma'am.
Yeah, so my question was, what kind of support do you or efforts are being made with your unit in regards to the Valley, South, and Western bureaus to address this issue?
I'm sorry.
What are you doing in terms of the unit? What kind of supports are you offering the Valley and the South and Western bureaus when it comes to human trafficking? How are you supporting their efforts?
Well,
The
unit is responsible for all minors who are identified as sexually exploited children and the victims of human trafficking. So we primarily handle all of the juveniles. If there is a victim who happens to be an adult who is either kidnapped, hospitalized by a John or a pimp, or brought across state lines, then we will also take those. It's on a case-by-case basis for anything outside of that.
So if they've made an arrest or rescued a minor, then your unit will intervene and take over
Yes.
I wouldn't say take over the minor, but
The
pretty much
investigation.
investigation.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And so what other kinds of, your unit in particular, how are you assisting the county's task force on human trafficking? The county has one as well.
We're part of that. When I
so-
said the LASD, we're embedded in that task force. So we have one investigator who works directly
Directly with the task force?
Yes.
And that's on
they
an
do-
ongoing basis or just when as needed?
No, it's ongoing. They meet every week, so they exchange information. We work on some of their investigations with them. They provide us resources because, as I said earlier, we only have 6 investigators in DSVD. So we use their resources, the Sheriff's Department specifically. They do come and help us on a lot of our operations.
And what major concerns are you currently seeing in each of the bureaus, specifically in the Southern Bureau on FIG and Western? I know they've had a number, I think their numbers are growing only because I think in the Valley we've been pretty successful in deterring some of the Johns and the Pimps from going into the Valley, but I know that the numbers have increased in the Southern Bureau and Western Bureau as well. So what major concerns are you seeing in these two other areas?
I think the major concern is, and I know this is redundant for a lot of people, but staffing and our resources, because we don't have as many people that the Valley can send out and put out there in the black and whites. I think it's a great opportunity for them to saturate an area. It's effective. It moves, and it makes people think twice about going into an area where they see black and whites. We have vice units that are working in all of those areas, and they're doing everything they can for their special operations. So my concern is that they can only do so much.
Mm-hmm.
They're definitely going out. I mean, there are nights where they'll work, and they'll get as many as they can, and then they have to go back and write reports.
Right.
So we can only do so much with what we have, but they are definitely making an impact because there are, especially in South Bureau, I know it doesn't look that way, but South Bureau has, believe it or not, had an impact in the way that they've been doing their operations.
Okay. And currently, what's your capacity in terms of being able to assist multiple cases throughout the city? I assume you have a capacity issue as well. Your unit, specifically your unit, to try to address the multiple incidences throughout the city.
We have 6 investigators, and they carry about 7 or 8 cases
Throughout the city.
throughout the city.
Is anyone here from the city attorney's office? Do you want to come forward? Do you want to come to the table? I just have two. Good afternoon. I have 2 questions for you. What areas of the city are you tracking when you make an arrest of a John? Do we have data to show where the number of Johns are coming from?
No.
Do we have any way to find out where some of these folks are coming from into these areas?
No. The way the John arrests, and I can defer to Sandra Dawson, Deputy City Attorney in charge of the Prostitution Diversion Program in John's School.
And that's my follow-up question was going to be about what our success rate has been with our diversion program, how it's going, but specifically I want to know where these folks are coming from.
Yeah, and that information will have to be taken from arrest reports of
Okay.
the residents, and you have to look at every single arrest report.
Do we have any idea where the majority of Johns are coming from if we make an arrest?
I would have to look at the information because we don't handle those directly from our office. I would have to reach out to each individual vice unit and do some research.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the success rate of the diversion program within the city attorney's office?
Yes, let me invite Sandra Dawson. I can give you some basic stats, and Ms. Dawson can get you into the details of the program. But since that program started in July 26th of 2008 to the present, it appears to be about 2,565 men plus 5 women have attended. A total of 68 separate programs have been placed. Do you want to talk about recidivism? It's hard to track, but for a short period in 2012, our office tried to look at who would reoffend, and of the approximately 800 attendees at that point, only 4 had reoffended. But that's a very short, narrow.
It's over a period of time.
That's only in 2012.
That was in 2012.
During 2012, that was just 1 year.
No, that would have been from 2008 when it started to 2012. We had an opportunity to run a very short tracking of the recidivism of the program. The program has been in existence for 10 years this year, and at that time, we had 800 attendees, only 4 had reoffended.
And you don't have any current stats after 2012?
We don't have any current recidivism stats after 2012. We have all the completion stats, but not the recidivism stats.
Can you run through some of those? Where's the completion rate after 2012?
We can give the entire completion rate for the whole 10 years. For the John School, we've had 2,565 men and 5 women, so a total of 2,570 people have successfully completed the John School. For the prostitution diversion program, Journey Out, which would involve sex workers, we've had 732 individuals to complete the program, 583 in the 8-session program, which is for first-time offenders. And then under Mr. Feuer's administration, about 4 years ago, it was extended to repeat offenders. And we have had 140 people to complete the 18-session program. So that comes up to the total of 732 that have gone through Journey Out since September of 2010. Watts Healthcare in the southern area has had 655 individuals to complete the program. And again, they started in 2010 to present.
But we don't have any recidivism numbers, right? Or repeat offenders? You don't have anything current?
No, we don't have the recidivism numbers with respect to running the cheers and the criminal history because we ran into some issues and challenges, constitutional challenges with that.
Tell me about that. What are the constitutional challenges? Why can't you track them?
Well, the city attorney's office, we have to have not just a right to know, but a need to know. And so once someone is outside of the prosecution, their case is fully adjudicated, we would not have the need to necessarily go in and keep running their criminal histories. We'd have to have a basis for that. But we do have some anecdotal information as far as recidivism. I think it was about a year or so ago, we contacted all of the people who had completed the second time repeat offender program and did surveys. And Journey Out had done their own surveys, and then we went back and surveyed the same individuals to find out if they had successfully come out of the life. And we found at that time we had something around 77% that stated that they had come out of the life of human trafficking.
Oh, this is only
But that was the repeat offenders.
Right, but this is people who have been arrested for, these are not solicitors. These are people who have been arrested for prostitution. These are not the Johns who have become repeat offenders. You're talking about two different things.
I am. Okay. Because the John program, we don't offer a repeat offender program. That's a first-time only program.
And what would you say your relationship is with LAPD when it comes to addressing human trafficking? I know they're at the table, might be uncomfortable, but I'm curious to know what is your relationship in working together?
You want to
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more about that. So traditionally, before human trafficking, this was all prostitution.
Right.
Prostitution, our office looked at offenders, right? We looked at the women, we prosecuted the prostitution-related cases, and LAPD would provide those cases. We have shifted into the victim-centered approach, so we're working at it very differently. With LAPD, if you're talking about a criminal case, our jurisdiction is only misdemeanors.
Right.
So who would we criminally go after? We feel if you have a trafficking situation, it should go to the DA, it should go to the U.S. Attorney. They should get the heaviest sentencing possible. So our role on the criminal side is limited. What we do really well that other jurisdictions don't do is the civil nuisance abatements. And you might have heard the Motel 6 case that we had brought in Silmar Valley and also in Mission Division. Those are the types of examples where we can connect trafficking that's going on in public to a location. And it doesn't have to be a motel. It could be any sort of location. And that's what we're trying to gear up. And so we do have partnerships with DSVD. Unfortunately, because of the shuffling, it's always challenging to get someone assigned to see those cases through. So we do have pending cases, but that's always going to be a challenge. We are in the process. We had some big meetings with Valley Bureau as well as South Bureau Task Force to really train additional people. So it's not just in one shop, but really the more people that can understand how to do these civil abatements, the better. So that's our ongoing working relationship with LAPD.
I can comment with respect to the diversion program. Sure. We created the original John School with 2 retired LAPD officers, and LAPD is a part of the faculty that teaches the classes. We have meetings from time to time with respect to curriculum, with respect to Journey Out and Watts Healthcare. LAPD is also very involved with the meetings that we have, finding out how the programs are going, and and have been available if we've needed to make those contacts in the station. As the lieutenant mentioned, LAPD, of course, is there, and they have a much closer working relationship when they bring in the drop-offs and things like that. So we've been partnering in this effort for quite some time.
And if I could add, we have other partnerships with other victim service providers. So Journey Out has been mentioned, and they are one of our partners. And one of the things that our office is very excited to see is that Journey Out is embedded with LAPD stations, so Olympic and Hollywood. And I believe that kind of contact, and Valley Bureau as well, when Journey Out is part of that initial contact, that's what's going to change that contact. You're not turning people off. When folks see Journey Out in their caseworkers, there's an immediate connection. They know that their caseworkers are typically survivors or other folks who have gone through the same experience. So you're getting a different contact rather than the typical law enforcement contact. So that is something that we've worked with LAPD and Journey Out and other folks on.
Mr. Chair, that's all the questions I have. I do have a request to make, but I don't know if other members would like to ask questions.
Please.
Sure.
Senator.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention. It's exciting to see this collaboration between the police and the city attorney's office as we work these issues through. And Reverend Dawson, always good to see you with another hat on. You know, numbers are important, and they really do matter, especially as we're trying to get our to provide some added focus on this important issue, especially since our colleague, Councilwoman Martinez, has really helped to shine a light, an important light, on this problem, not just in her district, really citywide, but citywide. One of the legacy corridors, as you suggested, one of the legacy corridors was Figueroa in the 9th District in South LA. And so I've got a question. Do we have any details, any figures about the types of populations that are exploited in our communities, and specifically in South LA, more specifically in CD9? Are there any, do we drill down that deep to get some kind of a sense of the kinds of trafficking issues that we're dealing with?
Are you specifically asking about the victims?
Yeah, victims and perpetrators, I guess. I'm just getting an idea of what the census looks like. Who's, what kinds of problems? Youth, prostitutes, under 30, over 50. I mean, what's the kind of demographic? What are we looking at?
Well, I don't have specifics on age and everything, but
Yeah.
I can tell you that the majority of the human trafficking that we see in City of LA is domestic trafficking, which means that we're not getting victims who are from overseas. We're not getting victims who are, that follow the stereotype when someone says human trafficking. They are girls, typically girls. I will say that the majority are females who have homes and live in the state of California. Sometimes they are from outside. They may be moved from Nevada, Utah, and other locations, but they are domestic victims. They are kids, like we all know, who have
So, I
computers.
mean, you say you just don't have those figures here with you, but, I mean, we're tracking that someplace, right? I mean, you know that there are girls, or 10,000, 500, 100? I mean,
Well, they're
do
not
we have some
all-
sense of what the numbers are?
I don't have the numbers. I will say I do not have the numbers. I can get them,
Yeah.
but we also have a mix of adults and juveniles. So I would be able to focus the numbers on the minors, and I would reach out to my partners to find the numbers.
I think that would be helpful, just to give those of us who are not dealing with this issue on a daily basis some real sense of what
And we should be
what the
able to get
dynamics
those,
are.
we should be able to get those numbers
Yeah.
to you easily, sir. But and I think too, along those same lines, what we also talk about as far as the populations is the profile of the victim. As she states, I'm over at Juvenile Division. I've worked over 3 years of vice. I've worked each of those corridors that we've mentioned from late 90s, from the mid-90s to the late 90s, where we looked a lot different at prostitution than we do now. But, I mean, the profile would be a young female victim with low self-esteem, comes from a family background that, lower economic status, tough upbringing, maybe some other sexual exploitation issues had gone on in the past. And I can say for a fact, that would be your typical victim profile. And that's why I think now, especially with her, Nuri Martinez, being the champion for this effort, I think that's how we're looking at it. We're looking at them as more of the victims, which they are, even from the juvenile side, and even our Internet Crimes Against Children unit, where these predators are looking for those same types of things.
I know that several years ago, I think it was Cal State LA that was doing the project on Figueroa. One of the universities, Cal State, Occidental. Well, my question is, do we have any involvement from any of the educational institutions? Are they involved in any pilot efforts, or are we doing any collaboration, either in terms of research or study?
I know Valley Bureau recently worked with Cal State Northridge to do but it was more, I believe it was more a environmental analysis to identify what areas they could change in order to minimize.
Trimming the trees and fixing this?
I don't know the details.
If I can
but-
interrupt, and CSUN was also involved with South Bureau to do the same type of study. And it basically looked at the built environment in the community. What is it about those corridors that attracts people to traffic women and children, but also, I mean, is it overgrown trees that we need to trim back? Is it additional lighting? Is it lack of neighborhood participation to sort of hold people accountable, signage? And it's those little things that, in my opinion, do make a big difference. I know the corridor that they studied in my district, we did put additional lighting, we made some of those fixes, and it made a big difference. And so that built environment, sometimes it does attract the criminal element, and I think it's something that we don't look at necessarily, but if you look at it from a larger lens, planners and engineers and so on, they will tell you, well, if you turn on the lights here, it wouldn't be so dark, and people wouldn't feel comfortable to have sex in their cars in front of someone's house. I mean, it's that simple. A lot of it is common sense. I wish common sense hurt, more people would actually do it. But it didn't, it's not that difficult to figure out. But I believe that there was a study in South Bureau. I can probably get that information for you. I don't know who would have the report about the fixes.
Was it Northridge then? Maybe it was Northridge.
I believe it was Cal State Northridge.
I knew that the big corridor was one, and I thought it was pretty interesting because they did identify just some common basic.
Just basic things that you need to do.
Putting a red stripe so folks aren't stopping, and.
And I know our vice units and our nuisance abatement unit also looks at those things. They do environmental studies when they go out and they have open investigations for areas where people do frequent. So that's something that is incorporated in our own investigations, not mine specifically or my units, but within the department.
Now, reference was made to a couple of task forces. Is there one in South LA? How do we?
Yes.
How's that organized?
There's a South Bureau Human Trafficking Task Force.
That covers where?
It covers, I don't,
8, 9, and 10?
Western Fig. It's Council District
I can
8,
do it by division.
8, 9, and 10, I want to say.
Don't know.
8, 9, and 10.
Okay.
And it meets a regular basis? It's a quarterly meeting?
I'm sorry?
It's a regular meeting, a quarterly meeting? How frequent is that?
Oh, well, what we call a task force might be a little bit different than yours. When I say task force, I mean that there are specific investigators that are assigned in a task force configuration, which is smaller than our divisional, and they focus on human trafficking efforts in the South Bureau area. So if Harbor gets a call, then they will have an opportunity to go down and help them as well. So we have kind of a double layer. If DSVD is not available to assist, we also have South Bureau, and then in the Valley, we have one as well.
Since this is our budget season, are you seeking any additional enhancements in the budget for, to assist in these operations?
I would like to say yes.
That's my annual ask.
You like to say yes, but the question is that
Yeah.
occurring? Do we know what's
I
happening?
think it would be helpful, at least, you know, I'm a lieutenant, so I don't really have the right position to be asking for money, but.
Right,
if we-
and I
You could ask.
I can find that out for
Get
you,
it.
sir, from
Mr.
what.
Price, to answer your question, yes, I'm
Yes.
going to ask for
Okay.
money. Yes, that's currently being discussed.
All right. Good. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Martinez. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you
Chairman.
for your leadership.
Thank you, and thank you very much for coming here. I do want to emphasize that since I began working on this issue, I think our attitude about who the victims are and our perception about who our victims are has significantly changed. I include my neighbors and people who just live across the street from any of these tracks. I think their attitude around who the victims are has changed as well, not only law enforcement in the city attorney's office, but I think all of us collectively have worked really, really hard to shine a light on this issue, but to make people aware that these children are American children, that this notion that they're coming from other countries, and even if they were their children and they're not prostitutes or hookers or whatever people want to call them, these are truly victims. No 14-year-old kid wants to stand on the corner of, Sepulveda and Van Owen and get, and turn tricks at 14 years old at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's glamorous. It's obviously someone's hurting them and threatening them, and there's a lot psychologically that goes into something like that. So I just want to emphasize that I think we're headed in the right direction. We obviously need more resources, and I'm going to try to fight for those. But I think the fact that now our neighbors and our community as a whole has definitely changed their attitude in terms of just saying we're going to lock kids up, throw them in juvenile hall, and not really find a way for them to get out of the life. And I think that's significantly changed over the past 4.5 years. So thank you very much for your efforts. We have a long way to go. To say that Los Angeles is not something, this is not something we're going to tolerate is absolutely true, but we shouldn't tolerate it anywhere in the country. The fact that kids come from as far as Mississippi or Tennessee to get trafficked in California, again, it's disgusting and unacceptable. So I applaud your efforts. Thank you for being a partner. And the only thing, Mr. Chair, that I would ask is that we go ahead and adopt this motion, and I would like to make the following instruction. I'd like to get a written report from LAPD on what resources that are needed to create a human trafficking task force in each of our LAPD bureaus. Without objection?
Sure, I'm just noting.
That would be my ask.
Yes, ma'am.
60 days, does that sound reasonable?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay,
Thank you.
Would you like to consider item number
3.
I have read it into the record, but I will repeat it. The city attorney report and ordinance relative to adding Article 5.4 to the Los Angeles Municipal Code to establish legal protections against the disclosure of tenants' information or citizenship status to third parties.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, council members, I was going to give a brief report, and then I'll be here to answer any questions. Just want to make sure a few things are read into the record so you understand. The draft ordinance before you was pursuant to your request, makes it unlawful for a landlord or an agent employee of a landlord to inquire as to the immigration or citizenship status of a tenant or occupant. It also makes it unlawful to require that tenant or occupant to make any representation concerning his or her immigrationship status or to disclose or threaten to disclose to any person information regarding that immigrationship status. The draft ordinance does have a few exemptions for sort of good faith enforcement of the lease agreement regarding violations of rental agreements rules and actual laws. There's also an exemption for any legal obligation under state or federal law to disclose information and good faith requests for information to authenticate applications like credit checks, that kind of thing. The ordinance itself makes violations punishable pursuant to the standard provision in the Los Angeles Municipal Code. That's section 11M of the code, but it does have a mandatory minimum penalty for any person who violates the ordinance with the intent of harassing or intimidating a tenant or prospective tenant or occupant. And that minimum penalty is punishable by a fine of $1,000 and imprisonment for a period of not less than 6 months. And so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So it's not, could you repeat that?
The penalties?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the standard penalty in the municipal code is sort of at the discretion of the enforcement officer. There's the A citations, there's an infraction, or it can be charged as a misdemeanor. The city attorney's office, the criminal branch also has the city attorney hearing program for first-time offenders. So any one of those are applicable to a standard violation of this section, if should the council adopt it. That's the standard sort of penalty provision for every single ordinance the city council passes, unless they specify a specific penalty. In this case, there is a specified penalty for people who act in violation with intent to harass or intimidate. And so in that sense, with an intent to harass or intimidate their tenant or the occupant, doesn't have to be the person on the lease, it could be the mother, granddaughter, son, father. In that case, the penalty is a minimum penalty is $1,000 fine and 6 months, up to 6 months in prison. Oh, excuse me, county jail, not prison.
Okay. My notes are a little, so that's the minimum on this, on the efforts to harass, right? That distinguishes it.
Yes, yeah, intent to harass or intimidate, correct.
Okay. Very good. Thank
So
you.
it requires intent. It's, yeah.
Okay. And third parties include any cooperation with ICE, any other governmental agency?
Yes.
Okay.
Unless there is an exemption for requirements to follow federal law. So, for example, if there's a lawful subpoena from a federal judge, then that would be an exemption. But otherwise, voluntary and transfer of information, yes.
Great.
I have a question. Do we know how many reported cases of property owners threatening their tenants with disclosing immigration status the city has encountered since this administration took office?
We
Do we have-
don't
how
have that
many
information.
cases? We don't know?
So the motion came up in response to a state bill that was just recently enacted. So up
Okay.
until now, it has not actually been.
Is there a way to
tried.
track how many people, so we have no idea how many reported cases there are of property owners who have threatened their tenants or actually
Correct.
given up their immigration status?
Correct, Councilman. Not with any specificity. There's anecdotal evidence.
Okay.
That's been written into the findings of this, that there's been anecdotal evidence that this type of harassment is occurring, and therefore there is a need to pass this ordinance to create a prohibition of it. But in terms of specific data, we don't have that right now. But with the new crime in place, in the same way with any other type of illegal activity with arrests and prosecutions, we'd be able to track that data on a going forward basis and provide reports to the council.
And do we have any sense of how many property owners are retaliating against their tenants? Because a tenant simply might be protesting a rent increase or maybe an inhabitable apartment or home. Do we have any sense of whether any of that retaliation against these tenants is taking place?
Again, it's only anecdotal evidence, but yes, that we have heard about that.
And how does the city currently process complaints from tenants about property owners who are doing this?
Well, there's the housing department generally handles the landlord-tenant relationship, and there have, especially through the rent control enforcement provisions, they have investigators that go out and handle these types of things. But this particular activity with respect to immigration and citizenship status is not something that is currently.
So we're currently
considered
not
unlawful.
processing any complaints?
I
The
don't.
city
know-
isn't?
I can't speak for the housing department, but what I can say is that it's not actually something that would be enforced by the city at this point in time, even if the housing department is tracking the complaints.
So there wouldn't be any consequences if a property owner is doing this currently until we adopt this ordinance?
That's correct.
How did you come up with the fine of $1,000?
It's the standard provision for a misdemeanor of enhanced minimum penalty that's generally used in state law, $1,000 and 6 months.
And I know it includes imprisonment time, so you would be doing up to no more than 6 months in county jail. What would trigger you going to jail for this? How many fines before you end up in jail?
Well, if you make a disclosure that is not with the intent to harass or intimidate, the penalty chosen will be up to discretion of the city attorney's office. But for that second category, to your question, Councilmember, at this point in time, the ordinance is not drafted with continuing increased penalties.
Well, maybe we should think about that.
That's something that's possible. The one thing that the city.
I don't think $1,000 is a lot. And so I don't know how many times you need to be fined before you learn your lesson or somebody throws you in jail.
Well, even on the first offense, you would get some jail time if you have the intent to harass or intimidate. But it would not. If you have a second offense, it wouldn't increase. It wouldn't double the penalty, for example. That's something that you consider. The limit for that this city council has authority is 12 months. The fine is generally considered somewhere below $5,000 for misdemeanors because the cruel and unusual punishment in constitutional case law, there have been cases. You don't want to open up a situation where the city is is charging a fine for something that goes beyond the level of the crime. So that's why we wrote it this way.
Oh, I see.
But you could go up to, you could make a mandatory minimum up to 12 months if you
Up
wanted
to
to change.
1,200?
12 months.
Oh, 12 months.
And then we could report back on suggestions
I
if you want
would-
to change
what-
the fine
is
amount, if you do that as
If
well.
there's no objection to that, I'd like to ask for you to report back on that option.
Yes, Councilmember.
I always think that hitting people in the pocketbook sometimes deters people from bad behavior. Sometimes, not always, but.
And separately, if you would prefer to focus on monetary fines and not jail time, that's your discretion
No,
as
no,
well.
both is fine. I don't have a problem with the jail time.
Okay.
Okay. That's all I have.
Mr. Price?
No question.
There's a motion to adopt the ordinance with the instructions and making clear that there is mandatory for those who use it with an intent to harass. I think those distinctions need to be clear, and that then as indicated, expanding the prospects for a longer term.
Yeah, if this committee so chooses, we could, if you are moving the ordinance today, we could report back directly to full council, and you can make the decision at that time.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Mr. Price, motion? Moved. Seconded, Ms. Martinez?
Sure.
Okay. So be the order. Thank you. Mr. Shea, at some point, we're going to want you to comment on the actions we've taken today with respect to how they fit in. I think one of the things that's significant in this instance, even though the evidence at the moment is only anecdotal, is that these are actually the actions that will deter and serve as anecdotes to the Trump's administration to engender hysteria, as they have been doing. That the clarity of the position of the city by its laws will bring solace to the immigrant community. Should. Okay. Finally, we go public comment first? Okay, can we go to public comment? We're going to go to item number 2. You want to announce that?
Would you like me to read
would.
it into the record? Item number 2 is a Los Angeles Police Department report relative to procedures and protocols to comply with SB 54 while protecting the public through community partnerships and adhering to the law regarding immigration enforcement.
Great. Can we hear, I've got Gilbert Salcedo, Crystal Rodriguez, Emmy McLean, David Aboud. Please come up.
Good afternoon. I'm Gilbert Salcedo. I'm co-president of the National Lawyers Guild Los Angeles chapter, and we are urging this committee to push for the passage of a strong sanctuary city ordinance. It is an urgent matter. We had a lot of pronouncements by city leaders about the commitment to protect immigrant rights, especially with the draconian immigration measures taken by the Trump administration. And it's been over a year that this has been going on, and we still don't have one. Many jurisdictions have already passed sanctuary ordinances, and LA is supposed to be leading the charge, and we're lagging behind. We need to do this. There's an Safe LA ordinance that's been drafted by this council's immigration affairs advocate. I think it's a good ordinance. We should pass it. The LAPD chief issued a directive that has limited some of the entanglement with immigration enforcement, but we need to go further than that. We need to, prohibit access of ICE into the jails. We need to prohibit any sharing of information and collection of information from detainees,
Thank you.
among other things.
Hello, council members and Mr. Chairman. My name is Crystal Rodriguez, and I'm with the California Immigrant Youth Justice Alliance. I'm here to speak on LAPD's recent order concerning SB 54 and to say why I find it to be insufficient. As an advocate of undocumented youth, I was reached out to by a DACA recipient in Boyle Heights whose father was detained by ICE due to an old conviction of domestic violence. And as I spoke with the family, it appeared to me that they had healed since this incident and were willing to fight against the odds to ensure that her father could remain with them. The father was also their primary breadwinner, and I could tell already that his deportation could bring about a slew of economic and mental health challenges for the entire family. In a climate that criminalizes all immigrants, I ask that you act boldly. The order introduced by Chief Beck still allows for information sharing with ICE. It still collects the place of birth information for all those who are arrested, whether they are convicted or not. And to me, this isn't safety, and it further undermines trust between community and police. I support full-heartedly Peter Shea's LA Safe Draft Ordinance.
Thank you. Is Scott Doyle with us? Yes. You want to come up? Milena Jankovic, Kerry Kaiser. Emmy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council members. I just drove here from Adelanto Detention Center. There this morning, I represented in an immigration hearing Marcelina Rios, a mother of 5 U.S. citizen children, a street vendor, and a woman who has lived in her family home in Ontario for 20 years. She's been detained by ICE since October, separated from her family. She is in custody because of police-ICE collaboration. Arrested for a minor offense, she was turned over to ICE custody and nearly deported. She's not an LA resident, but her story is not unheard of in Los Angeles. Today, she was ordered release, but her struggle continues, and so does ours. Since this committee last met, the Trump-Sessions efforts to make this country white again have not stopped. They are militarizing the border. They're eliminating the possibility of people having access to their rights in detention centers. They are suing the state of California. They are riling up Fox News in the most conservative parts of the state. Where will LA stand in the midst of this battle of values where our community members are the collateral damage? With all due respect, the chief's directive is a start, but it must not be the end. With all due respect, SB 54 is an enormous advance, but it's not all that must be done. We urge the City Council to act to defend our communities and prohibit the use of city resources for immigration enforcement. Thank you.
Scott Doyle.
Good afternoon. The last few weeks have been a time of reckoning in California for immigrant rights. Across the state and across Southern California, there has been a flurry of political activity at the local level, with various city councils and boards of supervisors weighing in on SB 54. In considering the question today of LAPD's compliance with SB 54, this committee has a choice. You can play it safe and frame the issue narrowly, strictly in terms of the watered-down bill that finally reached the governor's desk, or you can show leadership and boldness and be true to the spirit of its author's intentions. The spirit and intention was always to clearly and unambiguously disentangle local law enforcement from federal immigration enforcement. This is not just a matter of principle, but also of concrete impact on the ground. As Michael Kaufman of the ACLU has testified before this very body, it is local policing and it's sometimes subtle collusion with federal immigration authorities that is the primary driver of detention and deportation. If, as some of you have declared, you truly want ICE out of your communities, you can start by getting ICE out of LAPD. Thank you.
David Abboud. Milena?
Getting Marcelina out of detention.
Okay.
Milena, thank you. Thank you for your time today. I'm a constituent of the 11th District. I want to remind everyone that SB 54 is not actually a sanctuary state bill. It's been a lot in the news as such. If the original intent of SB 54 was to establish California as a sanctuary state, the final version of the bill is far from a version that succeeds in that intent. Also, Los Angeles, regardless of what you may call it, is not in practice a sanctuary city since we don't have an ordinance in place. Mayor Gassetti's directive from last year and Chief Beck's directive from the end of last year as well are much welcome steps towards establishing sanctuary protections for immigrant communities, but they leave lots of room for improvement. It is up to this committee and this council now to fill in those gaps. The City Council appointed an immigrant rights advocate last year, Mr. Peter Shea, a person with a long history of quality work in protecting the city's most vulnerable communities. And I suggest we put Mr. Shea to work and ask him to draft a strong and comprehensive sanctuary ordinance. Thank you.
Carrie?
Yeah, I'm Carrie Kaiser. I live in District 4, and it's been really continuously frustrating and heartbreaking for me whenever the issue of immigrant rights in the city of LA comes up with, like, my friends, my coworkers, my family. Their perception is that LA is doing everything it can already to protect undocumented immigrants in this town. It's frustrating because I know that's not accurate. And I believe strongly that LA City Council needs to pass an ordinance like Peter Shea's LA Safe to address all the issues left out of the Chief's directive, Chief Beck's directive. Until an ordinance like that is passed, the LAPD is still going to systematically collect information about place of birth for those arrested and share this information with ICE indirectly. They're still going to participate in joint task forces or operations which result in information sharing and collateral arrests by immigration authorities. And they'll still arrest people in minor police encounters and turn them over to ICE if they were previously deported and have certain prior criminal convictions, even if they're decades old. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob Kwan, Onye, Joseph Vilela, and Mario Fuentes. Rob?
Hi. While the new Chief's directive primarily implements SB 54, also ending questioning over place of birth is a big step forward. Yet our council leaders need to live up to their language. They've claimed that we are at war, that LA is leading the way for immigrants' rights, that we are the tip of the spear, that nothing will stop us from being a sanctuary city. Yet we've seen no action. It's worth noting the influence, the unmistakable influence, of the Police Protective League. They've donated to every member of this committee, our city attorney, mayor, controller, as well as all but one council member. As parts of the state try to tear apart SB 54, our council has done nothing to even discuss how they can expand upon it. I hope that conversation starts at today's meeting, and before the next meeting, you introduce the Immigrant Affairs Advocate's draft LA Safe Ordinance, which would give meaning to our claim of being a city of sanctuary. Thank you.
Onye? No? Joseph?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Joseph Villela on behalf of CHIRLA, the Coalition for Human Immigrant Rights. I'm the policy director there. First, we'd like to thank LAPD as well as the advocates for their work in relationship to the guidance that were issued last year. They're a step forward, but they're the floor, they're not the ceiling. Having said that, there is an attack towards California in regards to the laws that we have passed. Sessions has issued a litigation, and there's also an attack within our state in regards to SB 54. 11 cities have moved motions to join that litigation. And the question is where the city of Los Angeles will stand. We urge this committee to start thinking about how do we enhance, and more importantly, how do we protect the due process of immigrants, and making sure that Los Angeles is a true welcoming city, and continue to build on the progress that we have done. And with that, we also will look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Mario Fuentes with LA Voice, a community faith-based in Los Angeles. I want to acknowledge Peter Shea. Back in the 80s, Peter Shea was actually the attorney who was defending me and my family. And we were coming to this city hall and speaking to the people that preceded you. And amazingly or not, I mean, here we are, some years later, speaking on behalf of the most vulnerable these days. And this is the Maria that, from a local public school that last week called me and says, my husband was picked up, I'm left with 6 children, U.S. born. what do? This is Beatriz, who called me today and says this gentleman that belongs to our congregation is in Adelanto Detention Center. What do we do? So I basically want to commend your work, and I want to urge you to support Peter Shea's work through the LA Safe ordinance or work that he has presented to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the department come up?
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Arif Ali Khan. I am the Director of
Mr. Shea, you want to come up now, or you want to wait till they're finished with the report?
Do you want to come out now or later? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you don't have to. I think Mr. Cedillo would like you at the table.
Good afternoon once again, council members. My name is Arif Ali Khan. I am the Director of Constitutional Policing and Policy for the Los Angeles Police Department. Seated with me is Captain Al Labrada, the department's Latino Community Liaison, and also the Commanding Officer of LAPD's Hollenbeck area. On behalf of Chief Beck and the men and women of the LAPD, I appreciate the opportunity to once again appear in front of this committee and at this point to talk about the changes or procedures, et cetera, since the enactment of the California Values Act, or SB 54, which went into effect on January 1st of this year. As I think the committee knows, the LAPD worked very closely with Senator De Leon and others on SB 54 and its development at the direction of Chief Beck. And we had a very productive discussion with them, as well as advocates who were in support of SB 54 when it was being developed, to address any of the issues that we had, so it did not interfere with our existing practices and procedures, and further reinforced the department's commitment to community policing, which has always been a commitment to developing community partnerships with all of our diverse communities, regardless of immigration status, race, ethnicity, and the variety of other features that are irrelevant to keeping the the city of Los Angeles safe. That concept of community policing is embodied in SB 54, is embodied even in federal law, as a federal judge pointed out today in a nationwide injunction regarding a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of the city by the city attorney's office when the LAPD was denied money under the COPS hiring program that happened today, and Mr. Dundas may be able to speak to that as it relates to some of these issues. But our commitment to community policing is unwavering, and our policies and procedures with regard to immigration and federal immigration enforcement are consistent with that. Just to briefly, if it would be helpful, I can summarize some of the factors of SB 54, which are reflected in the chief's directive, which was issued prior to the effective date, and then I'll let Captain Labrada speak to some of the efforts that the LAPD has been doing for quite some time now in outreach to the community, so they understand what our policies and procedures are, and then obviously can answer any questions that you may have. The best way to summarize this would be in such a way. What happens when the LAPD encounters somebody who may be undocumented in the field? What happens when somebody who may be undocumented is arrested and booked into LAPD custody? And then the third area would be, when do we work with ICE on task forces such as the Human Trafficking Task Force, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and what are our restrictions, procedures that we put in place to ensure that we are not engaged in civil immigration enforcement? There is a very strict both legal line and also a policy with the LAPD that has existed for decades, that the LAPD does not engage in civil immigration enforcement. Whether somebody is in the United States illegally, and when I say illegally, I'm not saying it's a criminal violation, because being undocumented in and of itself is not a crime. And it is your civil immigration status. Somebody may be undocumented because they have overstayed their visa or their application for asylum, or it could be because they improperly entered the United States. But that is not a matter for California peace officers who are empowered to enforce criminal laws, both local, state, and in some cases federal criminal laws, as an appropriate role. And we've remained consistent with that we abide by those legal restrictions. Also, there's really no benefit to the LAPD or the City of Los Angeles by enforcing civil immigration law in order to keep the community safe. As was recognized by Chief Darrell Gates in 1979 with the implementation of Special Order 40, which restricted LAPD officers from initiating any police action to determine a person's immigration status, since we do not have enforcement powers and it does not help us in doing our jobs or the officers' jobs of enforcing criminal law, we should not create a level of distrust that people who are undocumented, who have a civil immigration status that is not consistent, that they're afraid to call the LAPD or any law enforcement agency when they're a victim of a crime, when they're a witness to a crime, because that would make them even more vulnerable to crime and also make it virtually impossible for us to seek justice of those who are preying and committing serious crimes against people in Los Angeles. So when it comes to our field procedures, the LAPD has, as I mentioned in Special Order 40, has restricted being able to stop somebody regarding the immigration status. That is also still the case, as you can see in the Chief's directive. It is also that we restrict the officer from asking about the person's immigration status. That is not relevant to reasonable suspicion for a crime or any of the offenses that we would be asking about. So that provision and that practice is completely consistent with what SB 54 has. One additional procedure that we put in place, and this is based on input that we received from many community advocates in a very long process that we've had with seeking input not only from them, but from legal experts, examining what other cities are doing on a national and local level, was change what are known as our field interview cards, or FI cards. For many years on the field interview card, and I have a small one right here, which we issue 800,000 a year to police officers throughout the city, this is information that after making a stop of somebody and trying to gain information, or if they're going to arrest somebody, it's filling out things like name, date of birth, descriptors. For many years, we had on there a provision for asking for place of birth. And it was brought to our attention that oftentimes when asking for place of birth, we may be giving the misimpression that we're trying to find out what their immigration status is. So after this was raised, my staff and I, we researched what was the origin of this and whether it was actually necessary to take place of birth. And what we discovered is that place of birth was basically put on here, or its utility was that this form would also be used if somebody was arrested and used for booking, because it has all the basic information. And in booking somebody, and when we put information into the system, which ultimately goes to the county, place of birth is one of those provisions. In addition, place of birth is important because of our obligations to notify a consulate pursuant to state law and federal law and treaty obligations if we have detained somebody who is a foreign national. We are required for certain countries to notify the consulate that we have somebody in custody who's a foreign national so they could provide services or make a visitation, etc. But what we learned is that oftentimes we may use this form and ask somebody who's a witness or somebody who we're simply temporarily detaining to find some information or potentially a victim. And so what we did with the chief's direction was to remove place of birth as something that we would be asking on the field interview cards. So if a victim, a witness, or somebody who is not being arrested, we won't ask place of birth. I want to make clear, place of birth was never asked, and we haven't any evidence that it was being asked as a basis or a proxy to find the person's immigration status. And of course, not everybody who is born out of the United States is undocumented. I can attest to that, having been born outside the United States. But because of the possible misimpression it would get and the importance of developing a stronger bond with the community, we have taken that out. We do, as I mentioned, still ask that if a person is being arrested, which means there's probable cause to believe they committed a crime, and they're booked. But short of that, we do not ask place of birth. The other issue is what would we do if we came across somebody who there's probable cause to believe that they committed a federal immigration crime. And that would be, in this case, a felony federal immigration crime. It is a federal crime to illegally re-enter the United States if you've been previously deported. And that is something that a law enforcement officer would have the legal authorization to detain arrest and refer to prosecution by federal authorities. We do allow that. We have allowed that for many years, but it's severely restricted in when that is allowed. So if we were to come across someone and we were to find out through a check that they were here and illegally re-entered the United States, if they have a prior conviction for what's known as a serious or a violent felony, then we do allow a temporary detention, verification of that, and with the high-level approval of a deputy chief within the department, our Department Immigration Liaison, who currently it's Chief Arcos in Central Bureau, will approve an arrest and a notification to ICE and a transfer of that person, because that is a federal criminal immigration offense. And if we come across somebody who has serious or violent felony past and we know they've committed that crime, there's a recognition that that is something that we should take some criminal action on. We do not do that for all. It's reasonable for us to draw a line someplace in terms of what our resources are. But if it is a criminal matter, we will transfer custody. In addition, if there is a federal criminal arrest warrant that has been executed by a federal judge and indicates that a person has committed a federal crime, we will arrest that individual. But it has to be a criminal arrest warrant, not simply a civil detainer request where they're just seeking to deport someone. So a police officer coming across somebody, running them through the system, finding out they have a federal criminal arrest warrant, like any other federal criminal arrest warrant, we will execute that warrant and contact federal authorities. The second stage would be to describe, and I should just mention that all of these procedures that we have, many of them have been long-standing, but they're all consistent with SB 54. The second area I can explain is what happens when somebody's arrested. There are many provisions in SB 54 that apply to when people are in custody, much of which don't apply to us because those are directed about transfers of people from county jail directly to ICE custody. But we do have certain processes. Once again, we do not ask immigration status. We do ask place of birth. And as I mentioned previously, all arrestees are fingerprinted. And when they're fingerprinted, that is the way that ICE is going to know that we have that person in custody. Fingerprints are used to be transmitted to the FBI and the Department of Justice to determine the identity of the individual arresting, whether they have any other warrants, and also to put a record of their arrest. When that happens, the Department of Justice has an information sharing agreement with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and if they in their databases recognize that the person in our custody was previously deported, that's how they become aware of that person being possibly undocumented in our custody. And that's when they send us, or they have in the past, a request to detain that person, what's referred to as a detainer, so that they could potentially come and transfer that person into their custody for civil removal proceedings, or what's known as deportation. The LAPD previously would honor those detainers a few years ago, but because of court decisions would say that it is a constitutional violation to hold somebody in custody where there is not probable cause to believe they committed a crime, we since have not honored those detainers because they're simply requests. They are not judicial warrants. They are not alleging that a crime was committed, and they certainly weren't issued by a neutral and detached magistrate, which is one of the requirements under the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. So in those cases, if we were to get a detainer, we do not honor them. So what does that mean? If somebody is arrested, let's say for driving under the influence, they have posted bail and we are required to release them, we will not hold them longer than the law allows us to detain them simply because there's a request from ICE. There's some who argue that you're not following the law. I can tell you from personal experience, we have asked, even in the previous administration, tell us the legal authority that allows us to do so, and we would examine that. But because of recent court decisions, or court decisions a few years ago, and the advice of the city attorney, we do not honor detainers. That's also now codified in SB 54, or the California Values Act, but that's consistent with our past practice as well. Once we have somebody in custody, the issue of whether ICE can interview them or whether they're screening them. As you probably heard, there are many counties that allowed ICE to have people in the jails and be able to interview people to determine their immigration status. We have never had that. We haven't allowed that. We certainly won't allow that. Now it's illegal under SB 54 to allow that. So we do not have ICE personnel in our jails. If ICE comes to the jail and asks to transfer somebody who's deportable, we do not do a direct transfer. If the person, once they're released, ICE obviously has the jurisdiction to do what they think is appropriate. The only exception to that is that if they have a criminal warrant and we are scheduled to release somebody, we will transfer that person to ICE for criminal prosecution. The issue of accessing ICE access to the jails to interview somebody, under the California Truth Act, if ICE comes to ask to interview somebody who's in our custody, the requirements are that we provide notice to the individual, that we give them a form, which we have, that explains in their language of fluency that they have a right to refuse, that what could potentially happen to them if they provide incriminating or statements that could make them subject to removal, and that they have the right to say, no, I don't want to talk to them. And we comply with the Truth Act. We do not have, so our policy, consistent with SB 54, is that if ICE wants to interview somebody, we will allow access provided we comply with state law and go through that consent procedure. I may have mentioned it before, but it's worth reiterating again. We have never received a request from ICE to do so. Could they do that? Of course they could, but just it's important to note that's never happened. And it's also important to note that when LAPD
You've never asked to interview someone?
We have never had that request, and we've never had to provide the document, et cetera, to somebody in our custody for an interview. I should also mention that for LAPD, we rarely have anybody in our custody in one of our holding facilities or jail facilities for more than 48 hours. And that's because we're making an arrest and then they're entitled to the court appearance. And so typically within that 48 hours, they're either released on bail or they're transferred to the custody of the LA County Sheriff or another county if there's a warrant outstanding for their arrest. As such, oftentimes there's not even the opportunity to interview or even transfer the person because of that. The sheriff's departments, as I mentioned, have different issues. They have longer-term custody, whether they're waiting for a court appearance or maybe serving a sentence. And many of the provisions of SB 54 apply to that and have continued to be somewhat controversial, as I'm sure you've read in the paper. The final thing I just want to mention is that our work with ICE on non-civil immigration enforcement matters, such as participating in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, where ICE is a participant, participating in crimes against children on the internet, which ICE is a participant, human trafficking, and a variety of other task forces that don't have either as a primary purpose or as part of the mission of that task force to be doing anything regarding civil immigration enforcement. That is obviously very important to us that we not participate in civil immigration enforcement. We reflect that in our memorandum of understanding, and as we renew them, we're making sure that's in there, and there's certain provisions in the Chief's directive of the language that must be included. That's not directly a requirement of SB 54, but SB 54 does put restrictions on cooperating with ICE and that it should be on criminal matters, so it's sort of analogous to that. And then we also make our officers, task force officers, sign acknowledgments of LAPD policies and procedures that they are not to engage in those types of activities, and ICE is on notice to do so as well. The one issue, though, is we cannot control what ICE does as a general matter in their enforcement. But we've made it very clear, and we make it clear both in our direct contacts with them and as we amend our MOUs, that if they are going to be using this effort to do civil immigration enforcement, that we would not participate in it. They could do it, and this is an issue about collateral issues or if they do something downstream. Unfortunately, we don't have the jurisdiction to control that, but we make it very clear that that could jeopardize our involvement in a task force depending on how it's being done and what's being done. But we do continue to participate in those task forces. Also consistent with SB 54, we are making any efforts to do either criminal or if there is civil immigration enforcement, which we wouldn't be involved with anyway, to make that public, and we do so through semi-annual reports to the Board of Police Commissioners, and that information will also be provided to the California Attorney General, consistent with SB 54. I think that there are other things that are in the order that are somewhat self-explanatory. I'm happy to answer any questions about that afterward. But I do want to mention, so we have this and all of these sort of somewhat complicated issues. Immigration law is not the simplest area of the law. And some of our efforts on the public, with the public. As you know, we have made pretty extensive efforts to reach out to the community members, both by the chief and just publicly in the media, and also our efforts at the area level and individual officers. We've developed frequently asked questions, which I have a pamphlet here, which we've made available electronically, which we have published, or we have produced, I think, several 100,000 of these that we put out. We also have it translated in Spanish and I believe some other languages that are available online. And this is, we've tried to both simplify this so that some of the complexities are easily understood about what it is that the LAPD does and does not do, and why when it comes to federal immigration enforcement. And as well, we have produced this directive for the officers, as well as been doing quite a bit of training, and I personally have gone out to divisions to talk about these issues. So if I could, I'll turn over to Captain Labrada, who can talk more specifically about some of the community engagement efforts we've had.
Good afternoon. Even before the current concerns of the administration that we have now, LAPD has continued to focus on building trust. For us, it's a win, and it's a significant importance for us to continue to build trust. If we have a public that has fear of reporting crime, that enables the criminals. And that will continue to victimize these residents and the 500,000 undocumented residents we have in the city of LA. Prior to this current administration, one of the things that LAPD has learned is the importance of collaboration with our advocates within the city. A few examples are the collaboration in the partnership during the drafting of Special Order 7 that supported undocumented, unlicensed drivers in the city. Another example is the implementation of AB 60. LAPD took a very proactive stance in the forums and also ensuring that our community was supportive and, more importantly, aware of the importance of obtaining licenses under AB 60. Chief Beck even went as far as drafting a letter to Homeland Security supporting AB 60 to ensure the license remain consistent with the current licenses in California to try to reduce the incidence of fears of the community having a separate license. And of course, our partnership that we had in implementing our ICE detainer policies in 2014, that was a collaborative with many of the advocates also that are seated in this room. Post-election, the LAPD has taken a significant stance in outreach, education, and trying to enforce or ensure the community is aware of our stance, remaining the same in supporting undocumented residents. For example, right after the elections, we had over 90 forums over a period of 4 months citywide in all 21 geographic divisions in English and Spanish. What we did in those forums is offered the community an opportunity for them to ask questions as to our stance, also answered many questions, but also joined hand in hand with many of our advocates that, again, are seated in this room in outreach, education, and information sharing to undocumented residents to try to reduce the fear and distrust occurring because of the administration. We've continued to establish partnerships with community advocate groups as we have in drafting many of the recent changes in policies and drafts. Many of them are seated in this room, and we've taken some of that input that made changes to reporting and tracking of information that, as requested per the group. We've also formed a strong partnership with the Department of Consumer Affairs to target notario fraud that victimizes undocumented residents, another way to try to reduce the victimization, but more importantly, increase the trust. We partner with the Office of Immigrant Affairs here in the City of Los Angeles to do outreach and partnership with advocate groups and coalitions in support of undocumented residents. And as Mr. Alican has also discussed, it's been at every level. Chief Beck has made it very clear of our stance to continue to support our undocumented residents, to build trust, but more importantly, to ensure that they report crimes to support them. That information is being shared at every level, including our Community Police Advisory Board meetings, as Mr. Alican stated, both electronically, online, social media, through our neighborhood council meetings, neighborhood watch meetings, and officers, our senior lead officers, are proactively distributing, not only at our front desk at the 21 stations, but also within meetings, the frequently asked questions of the community. We ask our officers that are continuing to meet on a regular basis and having an immigration forums at the stations and partnering many churches and advocates throughout the city.
and we're providing the information necessary and, more importantly, dispelling a lot of rumors. Chief Arcos and I consistently take phone calls of advocates, residents in the city that are getting information, false information, misinformation, and rumors of ICE raids and other things that tend to cause a lot of fear in the community. And we actively seek out that information and provide the accurate information so our advocates and, more importantly, our residents aren't in fear. We'll continue to do so. We're not going to change any stance on our outreach, and we're very open to continuing building new partnerships and expanding that outreach effort with our communities.
If I could just mention one thing regarding the collaboration on specifically the Chief's directive. In addition to seeking the input of community members, advocates, legal experts, Mr. Shea and others, we also have been working very closely with the Mayor's office, with council members, and of course the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners to make sure that everything is consistent with the vision that the City of Los Angeles has about building positive partnerships with immigrants, communities, regardless of immigration status, while also making sure that we are enforcing the law fairly and protecting the community as well. So I appreciate the work that and the collaboration we've been able to have with this committee as well as the other members of the city family. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, or both of us are happy to do so.
Senator, any questions?
No, I think this is a important step, and I'm certainly just curious, what's happening in other communities, in other major cities that have obviously looked at this and have adopted, I guess, kind of a whole spectrum of positions, activities. What else have we seen?
So with respect to other major cities, this has certainly been a major discussion issue. I know Chief Beck, and I've been at various forums with other major cities. They have often, in the law enforcement community, has taken positions similar to ours, which is that we should not be expected to enforce civil immigration law. We should not be doing things that could potentially deter members of the public from coming forward out of fear of a civil deportation proceeding, and they have supported those types of efforts. It's hard to say exactly what they're doing and why, simply because every city has its own history and its own statutes, and then you have other complications, for example, in Texas, where the state legislature passed a law saying essentially you must cooperate, in the tension that they've had there. But I think we are one of the more progressive and balanced cities in terms of how we are addressing this important issue.
Now, we know the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General had some negative comments to make about those cities and states that were seeking this status. Have we heard any more rumblings from the federal government in terms of taking specific actions against jurisdictions who are adopting these policies?
Having been a federal official for many years, I can tell you the rumbling seems to be getting constant and louder. Unfortunately, I think some of the rumbling that we hear from the federal government tends to be more about rhetoric than specifically the law. We've made it very clear. We comply with federal law, we comply with state law, and obviously we comply with the laws and ordinances of the city. We believe in protecting the community through community partnerships and following the law and Constitution. And much of what has been said actually is irrelevant of that, whether it's Supreme Court precedent or actually what's being done. We've done our best. I fortunately have had some productive communications with the federal government on this, but as I think we all know, there's different layers in the political spectrum.
I appreciate the efforts that the police have taken to make it clear that we're on the side of our immigrant community. We're not trying to round folks up or to accelerate their deportation. So it's important, I think, that we be clear, that we be consistent in that tone. And I think from the chief down, we've seen that at policy level expressed. So thanks for your efforts.
Thank you.
Ms. Martinez.
So can you talk briefly about what are some of the provisions or updates that you've made to Special Order 40 since the order was enacted? I know we met and we talked a little bit about that. So specifically, have we clarified, because I've read the order, and I haven't read the latest update, but if you read it in the past, it's not, it needs clarification and it's a little bit ambiguous, but there's language in there that I always thought needed to get cleaned up. I mean, there were still references to people as illegal aliens, for example. Getting it signed by a new chief would actually help, and then communicate that back to the public. So can you talk a little bit about the updates?
Certainly, and I think it's important to maybe explain a little bit what is a special order and how does it fit in. Special Order 40 that you're referring to is from 1979. It was proposed by the department and adopted by the Police Commission. A special order is one of the ways you could view it is a special order is like a motion that's being introduced by council members. And that motion could be to amend a particular provision in the municipal code or the administrative code. It's sort of like a bill in Congress. And that order is then adopted by the Police Commission and then inserted into the appropriate code within the department. For example, the department manual. So back in 1979, that language, once adopted, became part of the department manual. But that does not embody all of the issues or all the policies and procedures that the LAPD has developed since then on dealing with issues about immigration enforcement. There have been subsequent chief's orders. There have been other special orders, for example, on consular notification or dealing with U or T visas. Those are other things that are similarly introduced, like a motion, through a special order, and then adopted and put in the manual. So, with reference to some of the language that is in Special Order 40, which is of course dated, much of that language doesn't exist in the manual, and as part of this process of looking at all of our special orders, directives that have evolved over the last 30 years, we have cleaned up some of those references. In fact, we have a specific, we've gone through and changed so we do not refer to people as aliens. And some of the other language. Even some of the entities that are referred to in Special Order 40 don't exist anymore. But that's not of any consequence because it's what's in the department manual that matters, and much of that has been updated through other means. The important thing about the Chief's directive is that we have taken all of the things, whether it's what the core aspects of Special Order 40 or what the law has now said about detainers and other directives, we have many different ways to tell officers what they can and can't do, have all been incorporated into one document, which is the Chief's directive that has been issued. So, so I think if you look at the Chief's directive, as I was explaining, everything from when we come in contact with somebody in the field to when they're arrested, or how we work with ICE on task forces or joint operations, are all laid out in that one document. So every Los Angeles police officer can refer to that document and know exactly what it is that's permissible or not. Additional details, for example, if you work in the Office of Special Operations and Detective Bureau, they have issued further guidance on very specific things about paperwork, et cetera, as has the Office of Operations for Patrol Officers. So I just think it's important to understand what that means, because oftentimes people say, well, have you updated Special Order 40? Special Order 40 as a document doesn't exist anymore. It's what's in the department manual that was adopted from Special Order 40, and then everything else we've added. So just as an example, over the last few years, things that we've changed that aren't reflected in Special Order 40. Detainers. We do not honor detainers. Detainers didn't exist in 1979 as far as I know, but we've issued guidance and now it's reflected in both SB 54 and the Chief's directive. Consular notifications, just all of these things, obviously not asking place of birth, are all more recent changes, but that does not require an update to Special Order 40. That's simply to make sure that that is implemented as the department's policies and procedures, which was done either through statute, through another order, or through the Chief's directive.
I have a second question. Thank you for clarifying that. Does the department extend the time for an arrestee in jail based on the immigration detainer request that they might have received? Do you extend the time that that person's detained?
Absolutely not. If a person has been detained and arrested for a criminal offense and they are lawfully to be released, either because they posted bail or maybe the case has been dismissed or whatever it may be, we do not hold people in custody beyond that which we are allowed to under the law, and we do not do so based on an immigration detainer request. It would have to be a judicial warrant. In other words, ICE would have had to go to a judge and get a warrant that says that you should take custody of this person and bring that person before that judge. Absent that, we will not extend the time in which a person spends in custody pursuant to a detainer request from ICE.
So maybe I misunderstood. I was under the impression that a detainer request is something that ICE might request of LAPD to voluntarily hold an arrestee for an additional 48 hours.
It is. That is correct.
That is
but
correct.
We do not honor that.
Okay, got it.
We do not honor that. And that's because the law, as determined by federal judges and people we are bound to abide by, say that it is not constitutional to do so. I defer to Mr. Dundas to make sure I've characterized that correctly, but that's my understanding of how. In terms of practice, we do not honor them.
That's what I'm asking.
And that's the basis for it.
The other question I had, I think you talked about the misperceptions about in the community in terms of the rumor mill and the fact that people are just quite frankly just terrified. But what are the biggest misconceptions about SB 54 that you hear from the advocates and just regular folk?
Well, I think it continues to be the collaboration with the jails. I think seems to be the most significant part of that. But I think that's been addressed already. That was the most of the concerns that I was hearing, that we're allowing full access and the interviewings and everything. And as Mr. Alicant has stated, it hasn't been occurring. So I think that was the biggest misperception. When I referred to the misperception and the rumor bill, it's had to really do with more of the ICE raids in the community warehouses. You know, for instance, about a month ago, I received a call that we were doing an ICE raid over off of Western in Wilshire Division on an MTA bus. And it turned out the police were doing an undercover sting on vandalism suspects because they were tagging up buses, MTA buses. So we were able to get that information out from our MTA folks and get back to the advocates and let them know, no, it was an arrest due to vandalism, not had anything to do with the immigration. So those are the examples I was trying to quote on that.
And are these phone calls that you're getting, or do people go to social media and start basically disseminating this information without getting the facts straight necessarily, and then you have to figure out how to shut it down? Or what do you do?
Most of them are phone calls. Okay. Chief Arcos, I would get calls from some of the advocate groups. That some of them are seated in this room. They'll call and they say, we're hearing this. Or just residents that know we're working on the progressive effort on immigration. And they'll call specific questions and we'll get those rumors back out. But we have it in social media as well. And we'll answer those requests, or we'll call those people that are putting that information out, or try to get back to them directly and try to get that information. It works best if we do a little bit of research and get the correct information out as much as we can. I don't see as much of it anymore because we are aware when ICE is operating within the city, and we know that we're not participating in that.
And I should mention, because I apologize, I didn't mention this before, the LAPD, if ICE is going to do an immigration raid or do a workplace inspection like they did in 7-Elevens that received quite a bit of press, the LAPD will not participate in that. We will not obviously participate in the operation. We do not provide perimeter security. We do not participate in that. We may be aware of it because ICE lets us know, in part so that we don't inadvertently participate, but also in case something happens and there's an emergency that's necessary for us to respond, we know what we're responding to, but we do not participate. And I think many of the rumors and the social media tend to relate to that, and we always have to clarify that's not our operation.
That's all I have. Thanks. That's all I have.
Edison. Mr. Shea, you want to comment on the court's ruling this morning or today?
I defer to Mr. Dundas about that since he's the attorney on the litigation.
Well, did you have a question on how the litigation relates to SB 54? I mean, we could, yeah. It's so they're related, but they are two different cases. This case from this morning was the City of Los Angeles lawsuit against the Attorney General related to the imposition of immigration conditions on the COPS hiring grant, the community policing grant created by Congress. In that order, the judge said today that the 3 immigration-related bonus points based at the federal government attached to the COPS grants were unconstitutional and violated the APA and every other claim that the city, cause of action the city filed against the Department of Justice. While there may be similar themes and arguments presented in the U.S. v. California case filed by the Attorney General, they are not the same, and so that case is proceeding on a different track up in Sacramento. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Shea?
Great, thank you. I guess just to start and to put this in context, I did want to just take 30 seconds to sort of outline some of the bigger picture things that I've discussed with each of you that we hope to accomplish over the next 6, 8 months, whatever, just so we can then see this LAPD stuff because I think there is a relationship between many of the things we've discussed. So not to get into them, but just to remind us the other things on the plate that might relate to this LAPD thing. One was certainly human rights ordinance that you guys have voted on, is over at the city attorney's office now, and I think they're looking at it. And we've had discussion about decriminalization, we haven't really started on, but looking at some minor crimes that impact on homeless people, that impact on police resources, that impact on immigrants, African American, low-income folks in the community. We certainly discussed this LAPD thing that we'll circle back to, the legal representation letters, and at some point also looking at racial disparity issues. So I think this conversation, at some point, we also need to sort of think how all these things relate together, and they do. I think that the issues, number one, there's no question that LAPD has looked carefully at these issues, has spent time. I know you've met with Chief Beck. I've met with Chief Beck. There have been positive meetings with stakeholders. I know that Captain Labrada and Mr. Ali Khan have met with stakeholders. They met with the mayor's office. So there's no question in my mind that there's a serious and good faith effort to be looking under the Trump administration at these issues about the community and its involvement with the police. And I think important progress has been made. So here's what I think. I don't want to look backwards that much because we now have the mayor put out his
Directive?
Yeah, his directive, exactly. LAPD has now come out with something the end of December. So there's progress. I don't want to look so much backwards as much as forwards. Where do we go from here? What do I think, at least, about where we go from here? I think in looking at the progress that has been made by LAPD, it is important for city council members to understand, because there's a lot of mishmash, there's a lot of details here, it's hard to wrap one's mind about. But what's the big picture here? The big picture here is that you have SB 54, and I think that sets a bottom, that sets a basement. That says, it tells the local police and cities that there are a few things you cannot do. In our judgment, for the protection of the good of everybody, there are a few things we're going to tell you not to do. By the way, LAPD was not doing most of those things anyway. It didn't really change LAPD's policies that much. So you have to understand, there's SB 54, and through compromise, this, that, and the other thing, certainly wasn't as strong as it started. In the end, I personally have a hard time calling it a sanctuary bill because it just sets a bottom. It just, there's a few things here you cannot do, but it leaves an enormous amount that local police can do.
Let me ask you this question. I know I'm interrupting you, but with respect to sanctuary, can you imagine any law that can stop ICE from exercising their federal powers?
No. I mean, I think that You know, I represented folks in the sanctuary movement going back from the El Salvador War and more recently the new sanctuary movement. And today I have clients who are churches that are offering true sanctuary. They're telling federal law it can go outside. That's a true sanctuary. You couldn't have a full-blown sanctuary unless you're prepared to violate federal law. In my mind, that's when I think you're giving a true sanctuary. But I think it is important, I'm an extremist on that. I think it is important to realize that you could have a sanctuary city that most people would consider a sanctuary city, but that city has to make a decision about somewhere between the bottom of SB 54, the minimum level that it's at, and then you go, where's federal law? Well, federal law, unfortunately for the Attorney General and Mr. Trump, has a very high bar. The only thing that violates federal law is if you maintain information about a person's citizenship or immigration status, and when they request it, you don't give it to them. That's a violation of federal law. That's in like one sentence in the federal law. So it's United States versus California, Attorney General threatening elected officials like you that if you help immigrants with this and that, we're going to come down and slam you. It's probably not going to work because it's bluster, it's hot air, it's showboating. If they want those things, you know what they should do? They should go to Congress, which they can control, and they should say to their friends in Congress, we want you to pass a law to require the cities to do more than they're doing now. The federal law isn't strong enough, but they're not doing that. They probably know they don't have the support to really get that done. So they're threatening, they're suing. They issue these extreme public statements that you're a sanctuary city, we're going to come down hard on you, when you're nowhere close to violating federal law. Today, I think the report was important in terms of just putting into perspective that LA has pretty much always been in compliance with SB 54, but it also brings out, and both of the previous speakers made very clear, why don't they cooperate with ICE on civil enforcement? Why don't they do that? And they explained very clearly, we don't do that because it would frighten the community, because the community won't cooperate with us. And so, yeah, we could enforce that little bit of the law, but there's a net loss. People won't report crime to us, there's a net loss. Criminals will get away. But as you move up the scale and you say, well, and they say, but we will cooperate in this way. We will let ICE, even under our most recent position, we will let ICE into the jails to interview people. Or we will enforce, at least we maintain the power to enforce the criminal provisions, other than illegal entry. So re-entry, yeah. Anything that's criminal, we'll enforce it. We maintain the power. We will continue to engage in group operations with ICE, as long as they tell us there won't be civil enforcement while we're doing this. We will release data if it's publicly available under the California Public Records Act. We will release that data to ICE, when interestingly enough, if you actually look at the Public Records Act of California, it excludes federal agencies. ICE doesn't even have a right to that data. All I'm saying is there are 3 or 4 or 5 important areas that I don't think have been resolved, that are there, they're on the table, there's been positive movement forward. I don't think today is the time to resolve them, nor could we. They're complicated issues, and I think in the coming month, especially in transition with LAPD, I think members of this committee, and maybe not just 1 or 2 of you, maybe 3 or 4 of you, myself, the folks at LAPD who've been extremely dedicated to this issue, they've studied this issue, they know this issue really well. I think there should be further discussion to see, are there further slight modifications that make sense in terms of what? The same goal they have in mind. The goal is to keep people encouraged to come forward and report crime. So just like they say, We don't want to cooperate with civil enforcement because people will stop reporting crime. Each one of these other things you can say the same thing about. So they become complicated judgment calls about at what point does your enforcement discourage reporting a crime just enough that it's not worth doing. It's like a seesaw, and one goes up, the other goes down. The other goes up, the other side goes down. Where you put that is a complicated question, and I think it's worth further discussion, not over the next year, hopefully the next month or two, and then this committee could come back and could make decisions. Is this good enough, or is it an area in which maybe we should looking at an ordinance? And if you look at an ordinance, probably not just for PD, look at an ordinance for the whole city. Look at what Santa Ana did. Santa Ana has prohibited pretty much everything that they told you today they're still doing. Santa Ana said, no, you can't do that. We just don't want you coming into our jails to interview people because it freaks out people in the immigrant community and they won't come to you to report crime. Santa Ana used the same reasoning that our brothers from the police department use today. And it's the same reasoning. It's the further you go in cooperation, the less people will report crime. So where do you draw that line? That ought to be up to you at some point, in conjunction with the LAPD. I guess the mayor's office would have something to do with it. But Santa Ana...
Did they have experiences? LAPD told us today they don't have even one request. So we're a solution in search of a problem. Santa Ana have experiences with ICE coming into their jails?
Yeah, absolutely. And LAPD guys were right today when they said, and I've looked at all the cities. I can create a Dropbox for you and your staff to look at. I have every city's policy, every major city's policy already downloaded, and I've studied it. And he's right that there's a wide range of differences. Santa Ana has sort of a fairly recent and I think a progressive policy, and it's extremely simple. Most of these policies take 8 pages. You can't even remember what the first page says when you get to the 8th page. At least I cannot. Santa Ana's policy is straightforward, simple. It completely in compliance with federal law. Federal government comes to Santa Ana and says, we want the citizenship information you have about this guy named Peter Shea. They have it, they'll comply. So they're 100% in compliance with federal law, 100% compliance with state law, but on several things where LAPD says, we're going to cooperate because we just think on the cost-benefit analysis, we think that it helps us get some bad guys. Santa Ana has looked at that and said, no, we don't think so. It might help you get a couple of bad guys, but you're going to lose 10 bad guys in the process by discouraging people from cooperating with you. So Santa Ana is a pretty simple policy. They won't share data unless it's required by federal law. They won't allow their resources to be used unless it's required by federal law. Their position is, the federal government is tasked with doing this federal work. They're funded to do this federal work. They're trained to do this federal work. We've got enough on our hands doing local work. We just don't want to be involved. Thank you. Other than we'll comply with federal law. So that is a model to look at in what I hope will be some serious discussions over the next couple months, and then see where we stand at that point.
Mr. Shea, any other comments? We're prepared to receive and file and move this document into the record. Colleagues? Ms. Martinez, any questions? On this, you've asked a lot of questions with respect to, or we had the first part of this discussion around sex trafficking. You indicated that you guys comply with felony federal immigration crimes. Is international sex trafficking involved in this?
I don't think Captain Espinosa is here. I'd have to get in specifics, but when you're dealing with transnational crimes, and human trafficking tends to be one of them, that potentially could be something that the federal agencies would do as a criminal prosecution that's based on international trafficking, human smuggling, which often is in the immigration statute. So the potential is there, but I'd have to get back to you on any specifics to that.
The report's going to be received and filed.
Mr. Shea, do you have any concrete recommendations for us to start to seriously adopt? I guess I don't understand exactly where we're going.
Sure. What my recommendation would be is, the answer to your question is yes. And what I have is really based upon, I guess, two things. One is a review what other cities have done. So I've certainly done that. And again, I'm happy to put that in a Dropbox. It's a ton of research. But if you were really interested, you said, well, I wonder what New York does, you could just hit a document and you could read what New York does. But having said that, I guess it would also be based on my experience. In my experience, maybe marginal, it's of some value, but I must say their experience is of value too, because as I said, it's not an either or. It's not a mathematical computation. And you could say, let's do this much cooperation because we'll have this much more law enforcement capturing bad criminals because we're not cooperating. They're complicated questions. Nevertheless, I do have a set of proposals, and what I would recommend is if you just give me another few days, a week, to edit them down so they're readable, they're short, concise, and I could then share them with every member of the committee, and then I could follow up with you either in personal meetings or in conversations. And then I would, at least my humble recommendation would be then we meet and continue meeting with these guys who've been working on it and you know, and to set up meetings. We've already had some meetings, and not to end the process. If you ended the process now, I think it's problematic. There's a lot, you heard a lot of people speak today, and I didn't know that many people agreed with me until...
Yeah, neither did I.
Yeah,
I just didn't think people...
I had no idea.
I didn't think people liked you, honestly.
Yeah, right, that's what I thought.
That was my initial thought.
I was kind of surprised here. So
I am too.
So maybe I'm doing something right.
Change happens.
Yeah, change happens.
Change is too slow. So I guess what I'm trying to just make quite clear is I don't want to meet for the sake of meeting, and I think everyone here is very busy and we've got tons of work to do. So if we are going to come up with a list of proposals, I suggest that we put a timeline to what we're doing and the work we're trying. What is it that we're trying to, what's the objective here? What are we trying to do? To me, the most important thing is to try to make people feel safe in their own community so they can get to work in school. That's my priority. Personally speaking, that's what my constituents care about. So I just want some clarification and clear direction about where we're going, what policies we're going to seriously take up in the committee, where we're going to move over to council so we can adopt and we can keep this moving. I just don't, you know what I'm saying.
That's fine, and I've put so much time into this.
Yeah,
those are great words for me to hear.
What are your recommendations that we can take up in this committee so that we can adopt and move forward and give people some sort of relief?
Yeah. Well, let me recommend this. When you put time into it and people don't want to move on it, you feel frustrated. So I feel pleased to hear your suggestion. I would suggest that within a week, I will share my ideas with you, which are based on meetings we've already had. And then if relatively shortly after that, you all have extremely competent people working for you, if you could have somebody, you know, spend half a day, an hour looking at it and communicate back to me their ideas, their concerns, so that really quickly I can sort of have a sense of a set of ideas that without you committing to, I can sort of feel that you're comfortable with. And then I'd be happy to schedule another meeting with these guys in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and then either one or both of us or me report back to you at your next meeting on a month. And at that point, I could give you a sense that here's where I think there's some movement on. It's only about 4 items. Here's where I think there's movement. I could then give you a recommendation to say, I think you need to have another meeting with them, or, I think it's time you think about an ordinance on these 2 or 3 issues.
Okay, so a week? A week
Yeah.
to get together and talk about your 4 proposals?
Correct.
Got it, okay.
Anything else?
What a timeline.
Okay. Senator Price?
No, support the efforts of Councilwoman.
Mr. Shea?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I did have one other issue, and it's not related to this, but and it's something I just...
Sir, so when you mean it's not related to SB 54?
It isn't in the framework, not specific.
Yeah, it was with relationship to an earlier group that testified about the
The
TV.
subject matter, but not the
About the what?
specific.
About the trafficking, the group that testified to about the task force, the work they're doing around the trafficking.
Yeah, item number 1.
Yeah, not one. And I just wanted to mention, and I
Chair's
can
discretion.
talk with you separately.
It's your
about the-
discretion, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in response to my question and.
Yeah, it was in response to your
yes.
first question, exactly, sorry.
Because it's specifically related to their compliance with SB 54. I asked a question about them because they talked about them utilizing or where they cooperated with the felony federal immigration crime, just so we're.
And there's no question it's all linked, because under
There was a
54, you cannot ask people certain things, but if they're applying for a T visa or U visa, then you've got to ask them those things. So the only thing is nothing. The only thing I wanted to mention is that I think when the city is looking at these programs, which are great, they're with LAPD and whatnot, looking into how to help with trafficking, and I thought the questions you put about trying to get some data for it would be really helpful. Just to begin to also think about, how do you ensure that those folks get legal services? And my guess is they do. LAPD knows what it's doing. But I just think, the delivery of legal services to people who've been trafficked is critically
For
important.
the victims that have been.
For the victims.
Okay, well,
So just to think about for the future, how we tie that in.
good idea.
And if I could just clarify, I may have
Yes.
misunderstood your question. When it comes to the issue of T and U visas, which we routinely provide the endorsements, fill out the forms, we have very specific guidelines and oversight of it. We do not ask the individual's immigration status. That's one of the provisions that we have. There is an exception simply because if we see somebody who we could potentially assist and we want to make sure they're aware that they can apply, we have that exception. But even in those circumstances, we do not record, we do not require their immigration status. That's something that we clarified and reinforced through this order to ensure that we're able to provide that service to the people who need it.
So it's to help move them towards a legal status, not away from.
We do not record it, but we're helping them get that T or U visa because of their victimization or assistance to law enforcement.
Which they need and which we appreciate. Okay, Senator, Councilwoman, thank you so much. I know that you have, you must leave, and so we're just going to receive and file this report at the moment. And Mr. Price, you want to move to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Second, Ms. Martinez, before you leave, you can second? Sure. Okay, thank you. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.